Welcome to Story Planet, where we bring you relaxing tales to help you unwind. Tonight's story is Lighthouse Love, a gentle tale of the sea, of memories lost, and love that shines like a beacon through time. So settle in, get cozy, and let the waves carry you into a world of warmth, longing, and quiet hope. Now let's begin. The lighthouse stood at the edge of the world, where land surrendered to the wild embrace of the sea. The cliffs, worn smooth by centuries of wind and tide, curved like an old guardian watching over the restless waters. Against that backdrop of endless blue, a single figure stood, her long coat rippling like a sail in the evening breeze. Marianne had lived in the lighthouse for more years than she could count. It had been her father's before her, and before him, her grandfather's, a legacy of solitude and unwavering duty. The great beacon had always been her silent companion, its golden glow cutting through the dark, guiding lost sailors home. She knew its every breath, the way the gears hummed in their steady rhythm, the whisper of the flame as it burned through the night. But there were no ships tonight, only the sea, vast and endless, rolling toward the shore in gentle sighs. She pulled her shawl tighter, staring at the horizon where the sky bled into the water. The sun had dipped below the waves, leaving behind a trail of molten gold, soon to fade into deep indigo. She had come to love this hour, the quiet between day and night, when the world seemed to hold its breath. Marianne had made peace with solitude long ago, yet some nights, when the wind howled against the tower walls, she swore she could hear a voice calling her name. A voice she had once known. She reached into the pocket of her coat and pulled out an old, folded letter. The ink had faded, the edges worn from years of being held, smoothed by longing fingers. She had never sent it. She had never even finished it. It was meant for a man who had long since vanished into the sea, swallowed by the waves, leaving only his promise behind. "I will return before winter," he had said. Winters had come and gone. He never did. She pressed the letter against her chest and exhaled slowly. Some loves never truly leave, even when their footprints have long since washed away. The lighthouse door creaked as she stepped back inside, the scent of old wood and salt welcoming her. She climbed the winding staircase, her boots tapping softly against the stone steps. At the top, the great lantern pulsed with steady light, casting long beams across the sea. She ran her fingers over the iron railing, gazing at the endless black beyond. Then something moved. Her breath caught. At first she thought it was a trick of the light, but no. There, in the distance, against the restless water, was the outline of a boat. A small, struggling shape caught in the pull of the tides, fighting against the waves. A storm was coming. She could feel it in the thickening air, the shift in the wind. The sea, once calm, began to stir, as if sensing something unseen. Marianne moved quickly, adjusting the lantern, ensuring its glow stretched as far as it could. She peered through her old brass telescope, trying to catch a clearer glimpse of the vessel. It was not a great ship, not one meant to carry cargo or travelers. No, it was smaller, barely more than a boat, and it was drifting, caught in the hungry pull of the sea. And then a flash of white, a figure, a man. She gasped. Someone was aboard. Without another thought, she ran down the steps, grabbing her cloak from the hook by the door. Outside, the wind had picked up, tangling through her hair, carrying the scent of approaching rain. The boat was closer now, the waves dragging it toward the jagged rocks near the shore. If it crashed, it would shatter, and whoever was aboard. She didn't allow herself to finish the thought. Grabbing the thick rope she kept coiled near the entrance, she made her way down the uneven path toward the beach below. The cliffs loomed high, their dark silhouettes etched against the moonlit sky. The tide was already reaching for the shore, its icy fingers pulling at the sand. Then, a crash. The boat struck the rocks, wood splintered, and the force of the impact sent a lone figure tumbling into the water. Marianne ran. The sea was merciless, swallowing him whole. He surfaced once, gasping, his arms struggling against the current. She waded in, ignoring the bite of the cold, the weight of her skirts slowing her down. "Hold on," she called. Another wave crashed over him. For a terrible moment, she thought he was gone. Then, a hand. Reaching. She lunged forward, grasping his wrist with both hands. His skin was ice cold, his fingers weak, but holding on to her, as if she were the only thing tethering him to the world. She pulled with all her strength, her breath coming in ragged bursts, her legs trembling against the push of the tide. Finally, she dragged him onto the shore, collapsing beside him, her own chest heaving. The wind howled through the cliffs, but she barely heard it over the pounding of her own heartbeat. The man lay motionless, his dark hair slicked against his forehead, his clothes soaked and torn. Marianne placed a hand against his chest. A heartbeat. Faint, but there. Relief washed over her, but only briefly. He was alive, yes, but barely. He needed warmth, needed care. She had no idea who he was, no idea how or why fate had carried him to her doorstep, but none of that mattered now. She had spent years waiting for someone who never returned. Now the sea had brought her someone else. And as she looked at the stranger lying unconscious beside her, she felt something stir deep within her, a whisper, quiet yet certain. The storm had passed, but the wind still whispered through the cliffs, carrying with it the scent of brine and the distant echo of crashing waves. The lighthouse stood tall, its golden beams slicing through the lingering mist, casting long shadows over the sea. Inside, by the crackling warmth of the fire, the man lay still, wrapped in thick wool blankets that smelled of salt and lavender. Marianne watched him from across the room, arms folded over her chest. His breath was steady now, though shallow, the color returning to his pale face. His clothes, tattered and damp, were draped over a wooden chair near the hearth, drying in the flickering glow of the flames. She had spent the last hour tending to his wounds, small cuts along his arms, a bruise darkening his temple. He had been lucky. The sea was rarely kind to those it chose to claim. Marianne sat down, her fingers laced together in thought. Who was he? Where had he come from? His features were unfamiliar, yet something about him felt known. Not in the way of recognition, but in the way the tide always knew to return to the shore. She had found something in his possession, a small silver locket hanging from a chain around his neck. It had fallen open as she carried him inside, revealing a piece of folded parchment. She had not looked. Not yet. It sat now on the table beside the kettle, glinting in the firelight. A groan stirred her thoughts. She turned sharply. The man's eyelids fluttered, his chest rising in a slow, unsteady breath. A flicker of consciousness stirred within him, a hand twitching beneath the covers. Then, with great effort, he opened his eyes. Blue. A deep, oceanic blue that mirrored the very waves from which she had pulled him. His gaze found hers, unfocused at first, then sharpening. Confusion clouded his face, his brow creasing as if struggling to grasp the moment. Where? His voice was hoarse, cracked with exhaustion. You're safe, Marianne said softly. You were caught in the storm. I found you on the shore. He swallowed hard, blinking at the wooden ceiling beams as if grounding himself. The storm, his voice trailed, eyes darkening. I remember the wind, the waves. Marianne reached for the cup of warm tea she had prepared earlier, the steam curling gently above its rim. Drink this, it'll help. He took it with trembling hands, lifting it to his lips. The heat must have startled him, for he exhaled sharply, but he drank nonetheless, slow and measured. After a moment he looked at her again. You saved me. She hesitated, then nodded. The sea brought you here. A strange silence passed between them. The fire crackled, the wind hummed against the window pane. His gaze flickered to the locket on the table, his expression shifting. He reached for it instinctively, his fingers brushing the cool metal. Marianne studied him. That was around your neck when I found you. His lips parted as if to speak, then closed. He picked up the locket, turning it over in his palm, his thumb tracing the worn surface. He seemed to be searching for something within himself, something just out of reach. After a long pause, he looked up. I don't remember. A shiver ran through her. Anything? He shook his head, slow and uncertain. Not how I got here, not where I was going. His fingers curled around the locket. But this, I feel like it matters. Marianne watched him closely. She had known men who had lost their way, sailors who had returned from the sea different than when they had left. The ocean had a way of stealing pieces of a person, scattering them like broken shells along the shore. You must have come from a ship, she said. Maybe it wrecked in the storm. Maybe someone is looking for you. He exhaled, his shoulders sagging. Maybe. She reached for his discarded coat and unfolded it. The fabric was thick, worn from travel, the kind seamen wore to keep out the bite of the wind. There was a name stitched inside, barely legible. Elias, she murmured, his head lifted sharply. She looked at him. Does that name mean anything to you? He opened his mouth, then hesitated. Something flickered in his expression like a distant memory trying to surface, only to be swept away before it could take shape. I think it's mine. Marianne nodded slowly. Elias, then? He tested the name on his tongue. Elias. His voice was quiet, almost reverent. Yes, it feels familiar. The wind rattled the window, the lighthouse beam continuing its steady sweep across the dark sea. Marianne exhaled, standing. You need rest. We'll talk more in the morning. He nodded, though she could see the unease in his face. A man without memories was a man untethered, floating between what was and what could be. As she moved to extinguish the lantern on the table, she felt his gaze on her. Thank you, he said. She paused, meeting his eyes. There was something there, something deeper than gratitude, something she could not yet name. Sleep, Elias, she murmured. Tomorrow, we'll find out who you are. She turned toward the staircase leading to her small chamber above. Yet as she lay in bed, listening to the rhythmic crash of the waves below, a strange thought settled in her mind. She had spent years waiting for a ghost to return from the sea, and now the sea had given her someone else. She closed her eyes, but sleep did not come easily. For the first time in a long while, she was not alone. The dawn broke softly over the horizon, painting the sea in hues of rose and gold. The lighthouse, standing against the endless sky, cast a long shadow over the waves that rolled gently toward the shore. The storm had passed, leaving the air crisp and clean, scented with the lingering brine of the ocean. Inside the lighthouse, the fire had burned low, its embers glowing faintly. Marianne stood by the window, cradling a cup of tea between her hands, watching as the world awoke in slow stretches. Her gaze drifted toward the man still sleeping on the cot near the hearth. Elias, the name stitched inside his coat. He had not stirred much during the night. She had expected restlessness, maybe murmured dreams as his mind sought to piece itself together. But he had remained still, his breath steady, as if the sea had finally lulled him into a rare peace. As she watched, his brow furrowed slightly, and his fingers curled into the blankets. A flicker of something, recognition, perhaps, crossed his face before his eyes slowly opened. Elias blinked against the dim morning light, his gaze finding her instantly. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, an unspoken understanding settling between them like the hush before the tide rushes in. Marianne set her tea down and moved closer. How are you feeling? He exhaled, running a hand through his damp hair. Better, I think. His voice was still rough, as if unused for too long. He hesitated, his fingers brushing over the blanket before speaking again. I had a dream, or maybe a memory. She waited, sensing the weight of his words. What did you see? His gaze drifted past her, as if searching for something beyond the lighthouse walls. A woman. She was standing by the sea, holding something in her hands. A letter, I think. She looked sad, like she had been waiting for someone. He turned to Marianne. his expression searching. "Does that make sense?" Marianne's breath hitched, but she kept her face composed. "Memories can be tricky things," she said carefully. "They come back in fragments, like waves pulling bits of the past ashore." Elias considered this, then nodded. It felt real, but I don't know who she was. She wanted to tell him, to ask him if he truly did not remember. But something inside her told her to wait, to let him find the truth on his own. "It will come to you," she said instead. "Give it time." A moment of silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant cry of gulls outside. Then, Elias sat up slowly, wincing slightly as he tested his strength. "Do you think there's someone looking for me?" he asked. Marianne met his gaze. "There might be. Do you want there to be?" He frowned, as if the question had never occurred to him. "I don't know. Isn't that strange?" He exhaled, shaking his head. "I should want to remember everything, but something about this place feels familiar, like I was meant to be here." Her hands tightened slightly around the folds of her dress. "You were brought here for a reason, Elias. The sea doesn't make mistakes." He studied her for a moment before nodding. "Then I suppose I'll have to trust it, and trust you." His words settled deep in her chest, warming something that had long remained untouched. She turned toward the small wooden table where she had laid out fresh bread and warm tea. "You should eat something," she said. "Then we'll start finding out who you are." Elias smiled. "A small, grateful thing. That sounds like a plan." Outside, the tide continued its endless rhythm, whispering secrets to the shore. And as the morning light spilled through the lighthouse windows, Marianne had the strangest feeling that something had shifted, like the past was beginning to return, carried in by the waves. The evening tide whispered against the cliffs, carrying the hush of old secrets and forgotten names. The lighthouse stood steady as always, a silent guardian over the restless sea, its golden glow stretching out into the darkness like a beckoning hand. Inside, Marianne sat at the wooden table, watching Elias as he turned the small silver locket over in his hands. He had been staring at it for some time now, his fingers tracing the worn edges, his brow furrowed in deep thought. It had been with him when he washed ashore, hanging from a thin chain around his neck, and yet he did not remember it. The weight of it felt familiar, the cold metal against his skin sparking something deep within him, but the memory remained elusive, just beyond his reach, like a ship lost in the fog. Marianne watched him carefully, her hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea. She had not yet told him what she had seen. That inside that locket, folded neatly like a preserved relic of time, was a letter in her own handwriting. She had written it years ago, to someone she had long since believed lost. And now, the sea had returned it in the possession of a man who did not know his own name. "Elias," she said gently, breaking the quiet. "May I see it?" His fingers tightened around the locket, and for a moment, she thought he might refuse. But then, with a slow exhale, he nodded, unclasping the chain and setting the delicate piece of metal in her outstretched palm. The weight of it surprised her. It was heavier than it looked, as if the years it had traveled had settled into its very being. She opened it carefully, her breath stilling as the tiny folded piece of parchment emerged. Her fingers trembled slightly as she unfolded it, smoothing out the creased lines. Her own words stared back at her. "I will wait for you. No matter the tide, no matter the storm, I will wait until the sea no longer sings your name." She swallowed hard, her chest tightening. The ink had faded with time, but she knew these words. She had written them for a man who had never returned. But Elias was here now, carrying them without memory, without understanding. "What does it say?" His voice was quiet, hesitant. Marianne hesitated. She could tell him the truth, that this letter had been meant for someone she had loved, that she had tucked it away, unsent, only for it to return to her in the most inexplicable way. But the words caught in her throat. "It's an old promise," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. something I thought was lost. Elias studied her. Do you know who wrote it? She met his gaze, searching for something, some flicker of recognition, some trace of the past she had buried long ago. But his expression remained unreadable. He did not remember. Yes, she admitted, I do. The fire crackled in the hearth, filling the space between them with its steady warmth. The wind outside had begun to pick up, rattling the window panes, as if urging the night to speak the truth that neither of them could yet name. Elias ran a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. I don't understand any of this. Why would I have this? Why would I? His words broke off suddenly, his fingers pressing against his temple. A sharp breath escaped him, his expression twisting as if something just at the edges of his memory had struck him like lightning. Marianne was at his side in an instant, her hands gently steadying him. Elias, what is it? He squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head. A name, he murmured, almost to himself. I heard a name in my mind, yours. A chill ran down her spine. You remember my name? His breathing was uneven, his eyes flickering open, wide and startled. Not from now, from before. The room seemed to shrink around them, the firelight casting long shadows that swayed like ghosts on the walls. Marianne's heart pounded. He had known her name before she had spoken it to him. Elias swallowed hard, gripping the edge of the table as if it might anchor him. I don't know how or why, but I think I knew you. Before the storm, before everything. Marianne's breath trembled in her chest. This was impossible, wasn't it? The waves outside crashed against the cliffs, restless and urgent, as if the sea itself was whispering an answer neither of them yet understood. The morning air carried the scent of salt and damp earth as the lighthouse stood in its eternal vigil over the sea. The night had passed in quiet unease, yet the storm of unanswered questions still churned between Marianne and Elias. She found him standing near the window, his silhouette outlined by the early light. He had barely slept, that much was clear. The locket still rested in his palm, the weight of it no longer just metal but an anchor to something lost. Did you dream? She asked softly, stepping closer. Elias did not turn immediately. His fingers curled around the locket, his jaw tightening. Not dreams, fragments, he murmured, like shadows moving behind a curtain. A ship, but I can't see its name. A voice calling, but I can't place it. He exhaled slowly, shaking his head. But I see you. Marianne stilled, her pulse quickening. Me? He turned to her, his gaze searching. Not just now, before. I see you in the past, but I don't know when or how. I remember a feeling, waiting, watching the sea, like I was searching for something that was just beyond reach. A shiver ran through her. That was my life for a long time, waiting. He studied her, his expression unreadable. Did you love him? The man you wrote that letter for? She did not expect the question to strike her as deeply as it did. Love. The word felt like a distant shore, something she had drifted away from long ago. I thought I did, she admitted. Or maybe I loved the idea of him. The promise of return. The idea that love, real love, withstands time and distance. Elias nodded slowly. And if he never came back? Marianne sighed. Then maybe it was never meant to last. Silence stretched between them. Outside, the waves crashed against the cliffs, relentless and steady. Finally, Elias sat at the table, running a hand through his unruly hair. What if the sea stole my memories? What if I lost something I was supposed to hold on to? She sat across from him, their knees nearly touching. Then we find them, she said, piece by piece. Elias exhaled, his grip on the locket loosening. I need to see the shore where you found me. Maybe something will come back. Marianne hesitated, then nodded. At low tide, we'll go. By afternoon, the tide had receded, revealing the jagged rocks where Elias had been tossed to shore. The sun cast shifting patterns upon the wet stones, the sea retreating as if giving them space to uncover what had been hidden. Elias walked slowly, his boots sinking slightly into the damp sand. He scanned the landscape with the intensity of a man who knew the answer was near, but could not yet see it. "It feels familiar," he murmured, "like I've stood here before." Marianne watched him carefully. "Look for something that stands out. Anything." He walked along the shore, pausing where the water met the land, and then he froze. His fingers brushed against something half buried in the sand, a scrap of fabric, dark and worn, torn from something larger. He picked it up, his breath hitching as his fingers traced a small embroidered emblem on the edge. A crest. Recognition flashed in his eyes. This was mine. Marianne stepped closer, heart pounding. "What does it mean?" Elias held the fabric tightly as though it might dissolve between his fingers. "I don't know, but I know it belonged to me." The wind howled through the cliffs, stirring the waves in restless rhythm, and as the tide pulled away, Marianne had the distinct feeling that something long buried was about to surface. The wind carried whispers across the cliffs, tangling in Marianne's hair as she watched Elias clutch the fragment of fabric. The sea had given him this piece of himself, but it had yet to return the meaning behind it. He turned the scrap over in his fingers, his brow furrowed in concentration. "I know this crest," Elias murmured, "but I don't know why." Marianne stepped closer, her gaze locked onto his. "Describe it to me. Perhaps it belongs to a ship, a family, something that can guide us." He lifted the fabric into the light. The emblem, though worn, still held its form, a delicate threadwork of intertwined branches and a symbol at its heart. Elias ran a thumb over it, closing his eyes as if willing his mind to unearth the memory. "A ship, I think," he said at last. "Yes, I was aboard a ship. The name? It's slipping away, but I see sails, the way they caught the wind, and the sound of voices, orders being given, a storm." Marianne felt her heart quicken. "Do you remember why you were on the ship? Were you a passenger or crew?" Elias opened his mouth, then hesitated. His frustration was evident. "I don't know, but I wasn't alone. There were others, and something important, something I was meant to deliver." She exchanged a glance with him. "A message? A letter?" "Perhaps," Elias whispered. He stared at the fragment once more before his hand slowly lowered. "I feel as though I was searching for something, or someone." Marianne swallowed, the weight of his words pressing into her. "And now? Do you still feel like you're searching?" He lifted his gaze to hers, a flicker of something deep and unspoken passing between them. "Maybe I've already found it." The wind stirred between them, the sea retreating further, revealing more of the shore. Marianne forced herself to turn away before she lost herself in the depth of his eyes. "There may be more. We should look." For the next hour, they scoured the beach, overturning seaweed and smooth stones, searching for anything that might offer another clue. The sea had a habit of returning things, but it also had a habit of keeping its secrets. Then, Elias stumbled. His foot caught against something hidden beneath the sand, and he knelt, digging with his hands until he unearthed a wooden box, its corners battered by time and tide. Marianne crouched beside him. "Open it." Elias hesitated only a moment before he pried the lid open. Inside, nestled among the damp remains of parchment, was a single sealed letter, untouched by the elements. He lifted it carefully, his fingers brushing the unbroken wax seal. His breath hitched. "This is mine." Marianne leaned in. "Do you recognize the seal?" Elias nodded slowly. "Yes, and now I know why I was on that ship." He turned to her, the letter trembling in his grasp. "I was meant to deliver this to someone, and I think it was meant for you." Marianne's breath caught. The past had come full circle, washing ashore like a long-lost promise. The tide whispered against the rocks, and as Elias placed the letter into her hands, Marianne knew that whatever secrets lay within would change everything. The letter trembled in Marianne's grasp, its wax seal untouched, despite the years it had spent hidden away. The sea had kept it safe, cradling its secrets until the right moment. Until now. Elias sat beside her on the sand, his breath uneven. Open it. She hesitated, her fingers tracing the edges of the parchment. This was not just a letter. It was a bridge between the past and the present, between the unknown and the truth. With a deep breath, she pressed her thumb against the seal and broke it. The wax crumbled away, and she unfolded the delicate sheet within. The ink was faded but still legible. Marianne's heart pounded as she read aloud. To the one who waits, I carry this letter across the sea in hopes that it finds you before the waves take me. If you receive it, know that I never forgot no storm, no tide, no cruel twist of fate could keep me from returning to you. If I am not by your side when this reaches you, then know that I tried and I loved you until my last breath. Yours, Elias. Silence settled between them, heavy and full. Marianne's hands trembled as she lowered the letter. Her gaze met Elias's, and in that moment, the past and the present blurred into one. This, Elias whispered, this was my writing. Marianne swallowed hard. You wrote this to me. Elias shook his head, his fingers tightening around the letter. But I don't remember doing it. I don't remember ever writing these words, and yet I feel them, every single one. Marianne's throat ached with emotion. The sea didn't take your promise, Elias. It just carried it back to where it belonged. A gust of wind blew through the cliffs, stirring the tide. Elias exhaled sharply and turned the letter over, as if expecting another message. And there, in the faintest smudge of ink at the bottom, was a signature. His own. He ran a hand through his hair. I have no memory of writing this, but the words, they're mine. They belong to a man who loved you. A man I must have been. Tears pricked at Marianne's eyes. You are still that man. The past may have been lost to the sea, but you came back to me. Elias took her hands in his. His touch warmed despite the chill in the air. Then let me make a new promise. This time, I won't be lost. This time, I'll stay. Marianne closed her eyes, letting the weight of his words settle into her heart. The past had been uncertain, filled with tides of longing and separation, but the present, this moment, was something neither of them would let slip away. The waves lapped gently at the shore, the sky stretching endlessly above them. The sea had taken much from them both, but today it had given something back. A second chance. The wind hummed against the cliffs as the lighthouse loomed over the sea, its golden light stretching across the darkening horizon. The letter lay between them, an unspoken tether to a past Elias could not fully grasp. He had written those words, made that promise, but the memories refused to surface, locked away behind time's cruel veil. Marianne traced the edges of the parchment, her heart a restless tide. What if your memories never return? She asked softly. Elias exhaled, watching the waves curl against the shore. Then I will have to trust what I feel now, and what I feel is that I once loved you, that I still do. Her breath hitched. She had waited so long for his return, yet she had never imagined it would be like this, torn between the past and the present, between what was and what could be. I don't want to be a stranger to my own life, Elias murmured, but if the past is lost to the sea, then I will start again. With you. Marianne looked at him, her heart pounding beneath the weight of those words. Then we will start again together. Elias reached for her hand, his fingers warm against her skin. Tell me who I was, what I meant to you. She hesitated, then nodded, guiding him back toward the lighthouse. The warmth of the small cottage wrapped around them as they stepped inside, the scent of burning wood and salt lingering in the air. She led him to the table where old letters once tucked away in forgotten drawers lay scattered like relics of another life. She picked one up, the ink slightly smudged with time. You wrote this before you left on your last voyage. You spoke of the sea as a fickle mistress, one that called to you, but you swore you would return. You wrote of dreams we shared, of a life we would build together when you came home. Elias took the letter from her, scanning the words as though they might unlock the lost fragments of himself. And yet, I never made it back. Not then, Marianne whispered. But you're here now. He lifted his gaze, something shifting in his expression. Then let us not waste this chance. The fire crackled in the hearth, its glow casting long shadows against the walls. Marianne could feel the past settling between them, not as a weight, but as a bridge they could cross together. Elias set the letter down, stepping closer. We cannot rewrite what was lost, but we can begin again. Marianne inhaled deeply, feeling the truth of his words settle into her bones. The past had carried him away, but the present had returned him. And for now, that was enough. She reached for his hand, holding it tightly. Then let's begin. Outside, the waves whispered against the shore, carrying with them the echoes of what once was, and the promise of what could be. The fire in the hearth burned low, casting a flickering glow over the small cottage. The air between them felt lighter, though it carried the weight of a history neither could fully recall. Elias sat across from Marianne, the soft sound of the waves outside filling the silence between them. He reached for another letter, his fingers brushing over the worn edges. "Did I write all of these?" he asked, his voice a whisper. Marianne nodded. "Everyone. You were always writing. Even when you were away at sea, you sent letters home. You swore I would never feel alone." Elias studied the pages, his brow furrowing as if the ink might spark something within him. "It feels like another life, like I was someone else." Marianne hesitated before speaking. "Perhaps you were, in a way, but you are still that man, the one who wrote to me, the one who loved me. The sea may have taken pieces of your past, but not your heart." Elias exhaled, setting the letter down. "And you? Have you waited all this time?" Her lips parted, and then she nodded, her eyes shining. "I tried to move forward, Elias, but no one else could ever be you. I think a part of me always believed you would return, even when reason told me otherwise." A shadow of sorrow crossed his face. "I never wanted to leave you waiting. If I had known, if I had any choice." Marianne placed a gentle hand over his. "You are here now. That is what matters." He turned his palm upward, entwining their fingers. A warmth settled between them, something unspoken yet deeply understood. The past was scattered in fragments, but the present was real, tangible, something they could hold on to. A gust of wind rattled the windows, but inside, they remained in a world of their own. Elias squeezed her hand gently. "I may not remember everything, but I know one thing with certainty. I was meant to find my way back to you." Marianne felt a tear slip down her cheek, though she was smiling. "Then let us write our next chapter together." He leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "No more waiting." The fire crackled, filling the room with a golden warmth. Outside, the tide rolled in and out, carrying away the remnants of the past and washing ashore the promise of something new. The morning broke with a golden glow, the kind that seeped into the horizon and kissed the waves with the promise of a new day. The lighthouse stood steady, a sentinel over the restless tide, its beacon a steady pulse against the endless sky. Marianne stood at the edge of the cliffs, watching the sea stretch out before her. The wind lifted strands of her hair, but she didn't move, her thoughts lost in the rhythm of the waves. Behind her, she heard the sound of steady footsteps approaching. Elias, he came to stand beside her, silent for a moment as they took in the vastness before them. "It feels different now," he murmured, "like the sea is giving back what it once took." Marianne turned to him, her gaze searching. "Do you feel whole again?" Elias was quiet before he answered. "Not entirely, but I feel found, and that is enough." She reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his. "That is more than enough." The wind carried their silence, wrapping around them like an embrace. The lighthouse's soft hum echoed behind them, a reminder of all the nights it had watched over them, all the storms it had endured. And now, it stood witness to their beginning. "Do you think you'll ever go back?" Marianne asked, glancing toward the open sea. Elias exhaled slowly, as if releasing the weight of 1,000 unanswered questions. "No," he said simply. "The sea will always call, but I have found where I belong. And it is here, with you." Marianne felt the certainty in his words settle deep in her chest. She turned to face him fully, cupping his face in her hands. "Then stay. For as long as the tide allows, stay." His smile was gentle, his hands warm as they rested over hers. "I will never leave again." The lighthouse's beacon flickered one last time before the sun overtook its glow, morning fully embracing the coast. Marianne and Elias stood together, their hands intertwined, their hearts steady. The past had brought them here, the present held them firm, and the future awaited, as endless as the horizon before them. As the waves whispered against the shore, they knew one thing with certainty. Some love stories never fade. They shine like the light over the sea, constant, unwavering, and eternal. Thank you for joining us on Story Planet. If this story made you feel the waves, the warmth of love, and the glow of the lighthouse in the night, consider giving a thumbs up. And if it brought you peace and a quiet escape, feel free to share it with friends and family. Don't forget to subscribe for more gentle stories to help you unwind every day. Wishing you a peaceful night and the sweetest dreams.